There exists within the architecture of consciousness a peculiar problem, the coincidence of knowledge and capacity. Long before the contemporary proliferation of empowerment narratives, the traditions of Alexandria, the schools of late Neoplatonism, and the emerging currents of ecumenical Kabbalah confronted a question that remains unresolved in its metaphysical depth. What occurs when the individual discovers not merely intellectual comprehension, but the structural possibility of directed will operating upon the fabric of manifestation itself? The Magus, understood not as charlatan or stage performer, but as the one who stands at the threshold between pneumatic knowledge and its manifestation in form, represents a fundamental station within the economy of consciousness. This is not a role assumed through aspiration or acquired through technique. It is rather a position that emerges when certain metaphysical conditions align. When the soul has achieved sufficient differentiation from the matrix of collective psyche, when intellect has penetrated beyond the veil of appearances, and when will has learned to operate without the distortions of unconscious desire. The Hermetic corpus speaks of those who possess the logos endiathetos, the indwelling word, as distinguished from those who merely manipulate the logos prophorikos, the uttered word. This distinction is not rhetorical. It describes two fundamentally different modes of relationship between consciousness and cosmos. The former participates in the creative emanation itself. The latter merely rearranges surface phenomena according to preference and passion. In the Sefer Yetzirah, one encounters the doctrine that the world was created through 32 paths of wisdom, 10 sephirot, and 22 letters. The Magus Archetype concerns itself with the conscious apprehension of these pathways, not as abstract principles to be contemplated from a distance, but as living forces through which the adept moves with deliberate awareness. Here lies the crucial metaphysical threshold, the passage from passive reception of cosmic order to active participation in its unfolding. The Neoplatonic schools understood this problem through the lens of theurgic practice. Iamblichus insisted upon the necessity of ritual action, not as superstition, but as the alignment of the individual soul with the divine intellect through structured participation in cosmic sympathies. The question was never whether such alignment was possible, but whether the practitioner possessed sufficient purification to avoid the distortions that arise when personal will attempts to operate at levels beyond its legitimate station. What follows is not instruction in the exercise of power. It is an examination of the metaphysical architecture that makes conscious power possible, and the threefold structure through which the soul must pass if such power is to serve integration rather than fragmentation. The threefold nature of the soul admits no simplification. In the ecumenical Kabbalistic schema, one finds the distinction between Nefesh-Ruach and Neshamah, vegetative soul, rational soul, and divine soul. These are not layers in a developmental sequence, but simultaneous modes of animation operating at different densities of manifestation. The Magus archetype pertains specifically to the awakening and coordination of Ruach, the middle term, which serves as mediator between the automatic processes of Nefesh and the transcendent orientation of Neshamah. Within Hermetic alchemy, this same trinal structure appears as salt, sulfur, and mercury. Salt represents the fixed principle, the body's stubborn particularity and resistance. Sulfur represents the volatile principle, the soul's passionate movement and desire for transformation. Mercury represents the mediating principle, the fluid intelligence that can operate between fixity and volatility without being captured by either. The Magus operates primarily through the mercurial function, not as pure spirit descending, nor as pure matter ascending, but as the conscious articulation of the middle realm where transformation becomes possible. The Neoplatonic triadic structure manifests as being, life, and intelligence, or in its more refined formulation, the One, Nous, and Psyche. The Magus does not dwell in the One, which remains absolutely transcendent and unknowable. Nor does the Magus operate solely within Psyche, the realm of discursive thought and temporal becoming. Rather, the Magus cultivates relationship with Nous, the divine intellect, while maintaining conscious presence within Psyche. This dual citizenship, participation in both intellectual and psychic realms, constitutes the essential structure of magical consciousness. In each of these systems, what emerges is not a ladder to be climbed, but an ecology to be inhabited with precision. The three principles do not exist in hierarchy alone. They exist in perpetual circulation. Nefesh provides the grounding necessary for Ruach to operate without dissociation. Ruach provides the conscious mediation necessary for Neshamah to manifest within temporal existence. Neshamah provides the teleological orientation without which Ruach becomes mere cleverness and Nefesh mere survival. The disposition of the adept approaching this trinal structure cannot be one of belief or enthusiasm. It must be one of structural recognition. The trinal nature of reality is not a theory to be accepted or rejected. It is an observable fact of consciousness itself, evident to anyone who has sat long enough in silence to notice the distinct qualities of bodily sensation, emotional intellectual movement, and the peculiar stillness that witnesses both without being reducible to either. Trinosophy does not synthesize these three into a higher unity. That would be Hegelian dialectic, not traditional metaphysics. Instead, Trinosophy cultivates the capacity to remain conscious within all three simultaneously, allowing each to perform its proper function without interference from the others. The body maintains its integrity without being spiritualized into abstraction. The soul pursues its transformations without mistaking intensity for attainment. The spirit maintains its transcendent reference without collapsing into the psyche's dramatic narratives. This is the first threshold of the Magus, learning to distinguish between levels without dissociating from any of them. It requires a quality of attention that most spiritual practices actively discourage, a cold structural awareness that observes the mechanics of consciousness without rushing to meaning, interpretation, or emotional resolution. The Magus learns to inhabit multiplicity without fragmentation, to hold tension without synthesis, to operate across domains without confusion. The ancient texts emphasize silence over proclamation, precision over power, and structural understanding over experiential intensity. The Magus Archetype does not emerge through peak experiences or spiritual breakthroughs. It emerges through the patient cultivation of accurate perception across all three levels of the soul's operation. Only when this trinal awareness stabilizes does the question of conscious power become relevant, and by then the question has already transformed. The movement of the soul toward magical consciousness follows an invariable structure, though its phenomenological clothing differs according to temperament and circumstance. This is not development in the modern progressive sense, but rather a necessary sequence of metaphysical reorientations, each demanding the dissolution of what preceded it. The descent into materiality. The journey begins not with aspiration, but with catastrophic recognition, the discovery that one's previous mode of existence has been fundamentally unconscious. This is not the romantic darkness of the mystic's dark night, nor the therapeutic acknowledgement of shadow material. It is the metaphysical shock of realizing that what one took to be autonomous selfhood was, in fact, a complex of reactions, inheritances, and mechanical responses masquerading as agency. The Hermetic principle. As above, so below functions here in its most uncomfortable application. If the macrocosm contains both manifest and unmanifest dimensions, then the microcosm must also. The descent into materiality means confronting the ways in which one's life has been lived entirely within the manifest realm, mistaking the surface play of phenomena for the totality of existence. Every decision, every value, every supposedly personal preference, all reveal themselves as products of forces one did not choose and cannot control. This phase corresponds to the alchemical nigredo, the blackening, but it must not be romanticized. There is no spiritual virtue in depression or nihilism. The descent is functional. It breaks the identification with the personality structure that has been operating automatically. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of the breaking of the vessels, the Shevirat HaKelim, as a necessary moment in cosmic evolution. Similarly, the individual vessels of identity must shatter before reconstruction becomes possible. The soul discovers its Nefesh dimension fully for the first time, not the vitality celebrated in embodiment practices, but the stubborn animal persistence that continues regardless of meaning or purpose. One eats, sleeps, performs tasks, maintains routines, all while the entire edifice of previous significance has collapsed. This is not integration of the body, it is recognition of the body's indifference to the psyche's crisis. Confrontation with the psychic realm. As the identification with material automaticity breaks down, consciousness becomes aware of the psychic realm as a distinct domain. This is where most esoteric practitioners become trapped, mistaking the discovery of the imaginal for ultimate reality. The psyche reveals itself as a vast landscape of autonomous forces, archetypal patterns, emotional currents, thought forms with independent existence, entities that appear to have agency and intelligence. The Magus information must learn to navigate this realm without two fatal errors, literalization or dismissal. The psychic realm is not just psychology, nor is it an objective spirit world requiring belief. It is a legitimate ontological dimension with its own laws, its own inhabitants, its own dangers. The Ruach awakens here, and with it, the first genuine stirrings of magical capacity. One discovers that thought is not merely internal monologue, but a formative force. Intention proves to have structural effects within the psychic realm, creating tangible configurations that persist and influence subsequent experience. This is not the law of attraction or manifestation theology. Those are commodified distortions. It is the recognition that consciousness participates in the shaping of the psychic dimension through its quality of attention and direction of will. The Neoplatonic theurgists understood that the soul's ascent through the planetary spheres required specific knowledge and proper orientation at each level. Modern consciousness, having lost this cosmology, encounters the same necessity in psychological form. Each autonomous pattern within the psyche presents a threshold requiring precise engagement. To simply dissolve these patterns through meditation is spiritual bypassing. To identify with them is psychic imprisonment. The Magus learns the third option, conscious relationship without fusion. This confrontation often manifests as a period of intense inner activity. Dreams become vivid and architecturally complex. Synchronicities multiply to the point of becoming nearly oppressive. The boundary between inner and outer reality grows permeable in ways that would be diagnosed as pathological if not held within proper metaphysical context. The Hermetic axiom, know thyself, reveals its full weight here, not as psychological self-examination, but as the mapping of the psychic cosmos that one simultaneously inhabits and constitutes. Reorientation toward the noetic. The third movement is the most subtle and therefore the most difficult to describe without falling into mystical cliché. If the descent revealed the automatic nature of material existence and the confrontation revealed the autonomous nature of psychic existence, the reorientation reveals that both are subordinate to a third principle that cannot be derived from either. The Neshamah dimension does not announce itself through experience. It manifests as a peculiar quality of silence that is neither absence of thought nor cessation of feeling, but the presence of something that was always there, yet never noticed. The Nous, in Neoplatonic terms, does not develop or evolve, it simply is. The reorientation consists of consciousness recognizing its prior and continuous participation in this intellectual principle. This is where the Magus Archetype fully crystallizes. The power to operate consciously across levels does not come from the soul's ascent into spirit, but from spirit's presence becoming recognized within soul. The mercurial function, the capacity to mediate between fixed and volatile matter and spirit, form and formlessness, activates not as an achievement, but as a remembering. The Kabbalistic image of Jacob's ladder serves here, angels ascending and descending simultaneously. The Magus does not climb away from materiality into pure spirit, nor does spirit descend to redeem matter in a singular event. Rather, the continuous circulation between levels becomes conscious and deliberate. One learns to think with the body, to move with the intellect, to allow the divine principle to inform without dictating, and the material principle to ground without imprisoning. The ascent as continuous return. What follows is not arrival, but practice. The ascent is not a final escape from the lower realms, but their perpetual reordering according to the pattern glimpsed in the noetic dimension. The Magus returns to ordinary life with nothing changed except the quality of attention and the precision of alignment. This is the most severe test. To inhabit the same material circumstances, the same psychic patterns, the same limitations of embodied existence, but now from a position of structural awareness rather than unconscious reaction. The power of the Magus is not to escape conditions, but to participate in them with full consciousness of the multiple levels operating simultaneously. The alchemical gold is not a substance achieved, but a quality of being. The capacity to remain incorruptible while fully engaged with corruptible reality. The salt of the body continues its fixity, the sulfur of desire continues its volatility, but the mercury of consciousness moves between them with precise awareness, preventing identification with either extreme while honoring the necessity of both. Between the confrontation with the psychic realm and the reorientation toward the noetic lies what the tradition calls the abyss, not as poetic metaphor, but as structural necessity. This is the phase that distinguishes initiatic crisis from psychological breakdown. Though the phenomenology may appear identical from the outside, the abyss represents the suspension between reference points. One has lost faith in the material world as self-sufficient reality. One has discovered the psychic realm, but found it ultimately unsatisfying. One has not yet established stable contact with the noetic principle. The result is a peculiar existential homelessness that cannot be resolved through effort or insight. The Kabbalistic tradition maps this as Dath, the invisible sephira, the abyss of knowledge that is simultaneously emptiness and fullness, the space where the supernal triad and the lower seven are both present and absent. To cross the abyss is not to achieve a new state, but to surrender the very structure of achievement itself. This is where most practitioners turn back, because the alternative appears to be annihilation. The silence that descends during this phase is not peaceful. It is the silence of meaning's collapse, of purpose suspended, of identity held in abeyance. The automatic responses of Nefesh continue. One eats, sleeps, performs necessary functions, but they feel hollow, performed by a mechanism one is watching from a great distance. The psychic realm, previously so vivid and engaging, reveals its essential emptiness. All the archetypal dramas and spiritual experiences appear as distractions from something more fundamental that cannot yet be named. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may share symptoms. Depression is typically characterized by the conviction that meaning has been permanently lost. The abyss is characterized by the recognition that previous meanings were insufficient and that no amount of seeking will produce their replacement. The teleological dimension remains. There is a sense that this suspension serves a purpose, but the purpose cannot be grasped or articulated. The danger here is twofold. First, the temptation to return to previous levels of certainty, to re-inhabit the comfortable automaticity of unconscious existence or the dramatic intensity of psychic identification. This return is always possible and often appears as wisdom. I was getting too abstract, too detached from life. I need to ground myself. But this grounding is regression, not integration. The second danger is more subtle. The premature leap into noetic identification. Having glimpsed the insufficiency of both material and psychic realms, consciousness may attempt to simply abandon them, to claim residence in pure spirit, while the actual structure remains unintegrated. This produces the phenomenon of the spiritual adept, who speaks eloquently of transcendent truth while remaining unconsciously captured by material desire and psychic patterns. The tower has been built on sand. The Hermetic tradition emphasizes that the abyss cannot be crossed through one's own power. This is not theological submission to divine grace, but structural recognition. The self that would cross the abyss is precisely what must be dissolved for the crossing to occur. The Magus in formation learns to wait without hope or despair, to maintain consciousness without insisting on resolution, to allow the dissolution to proceed according to its own necessity. What dies in the abyss is not the person, but the illusion of self-origination. The recognition emerges slowly that one has never been the author of one's own existence, that consciousness itself is participated in rather than possessed, that agency is a function of alignment rather than assertion. This recognition cannot be forced or simulated. It arises organically when the last defenses against it have been exhausted. The Neoplatonic kenosis, the union with the One, is often misunderstood as mystical absorption. In reality, it is the recognition that separation was never metaphysically actual, only epistemologically necessary for the sake of development. The abyss teaches what no philosophy can convey, that the individual exists as a particular expression of universal principles, not as an isolated entity struggling toward connection. What emerges from the abyss bears little resemblance to popular images of enlightenment or spiritual attainment. The integrated Magus does not glow with charisma or overflow with compassion. The transformation is structural, not phenomenological, a reordering of the soul's architecture that manifests primarily as restraint, precision, and the capacity to bear tension without resolution. The threefold nature of the soul, previously experienced in conflict or sequence, now operates in simultaneous coordination. The Nefesh performs its material functions without the psyche's interference or the spirit's disdain. The Ruach pursues its discriminations and mediations without claiming ultimate authority. The Neshama maintains its transcendent reference without demanding the lower dimensions conform to patterns they cannot sustain. This is not harmonious integration in the therapeutic sense. The three levels remain distinct and often contradictory in their immediate demands. The body requires rest while the psyche demands activity. The psyche craves experience while the spirit calls toward silence. The Magus does not resolve these tensions through compromise or synthesis. Rather, the Magus learns to hold them in conscious awareness, allowing each level to speak without granting any level veto power over the others. The conscious use of personal power emerges naturally from this structure. Power, properly understood, is not the capacity to impose will upon resistant reality. It is the capacity to align will with the patterns that already govern manifestation. The Hermetic Magus does not violate natural law through supernatural intervention. The Magus recognizes the complete natural law, including its pneumatic and psychic dimensions, and operates within its full scope. This produces a characteristic quality of action, effortless precision. The Magus does not struggle against circumstances because the Magus has learned to perceive the multiple levels of any situation simultaneously. What appears as obstacle at the material level may be opening at the psychic level. What appears as opportunity at the psychic level may be distraction from noetic alignment. The integrated consciousness navigates all three without privileging any single perspective. The ethical dimension stabilizes not through moral code or spiritual aspiration, but through structural necessity. One cannot operate consciously across multiple levels while acting in ways that create fragmentation. Deception, manipulation, and violence are not prohibited by divine command, but recognized as incompatible with the integrated state itself. They require splitting awareness, privileging one level of reality while denying others, and this splitting immediately disrupts the Magus's operational capacity. This is why authentic adepts speak less, act with greater restraint, and refuse positions of public authority. The integrated consciousness recognizes that most human interaction operates entirely within the material and lower psychic levels, and that attempting to introduce noetic awareness into such contexts produces confusion rather than clarity. The Magus becomes, in a certain sense, invisible, not through occult concealment, but through the simple fact of operating according to principles most observers cannot perceive. The formation of the inner temple is complete when the three levels of the soul can be inhabited simultaneously without effort. This is not a permanent state achieved and maintained, but a capacity developed and refined through continuous practice. The Magus must repeatedly return to silence, to structural awareness, to the discipline of distinguishing levels without dissociating from any of them. What appears from the outside as personal power, the capacity to influence circumstances, to perceive hidden patterns, to move through obstacles with apparent ease, is simply the natural result of alignment. The Magus participates in the continuous emanation of reality from its noetic source, through its psychic mediation into material manifestation. This participation does not confer special privilege or supernatural capacity. It reveals that such capacity was always present, merely obscured by unconscious fragmentation. The final state is not illumination, but functionality, the soul operating according to its proper structure, the consciousness aware of its own nature, the will aligned with rather than opposed to the patterns that govern manifestation. This is the quiet authority of the Magus, not dominion over nature, but natural participation in the order that nature itself expresses. What consciousness achieves through inner order cannot be lost to outer chaos.